Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you, Madam President, to our Martin Center European Ideas Forum 2024 for this exclusive interview.
I was just telling Mikuláš that it's not so exclusive since I come every year, so I find it I'm just routine.
But we are sure you will have exclusive things to say. So yeah, we'll make it very interesting, I'm sure. A warm welcome to you, and also a warm welcome to our audience here today with us, and also to our online viewers watching us on the Martin Center digital platforms. Madam President, it is that time of the year when we usually draw conclusions, and 2024 was a very intense year, and it was also an important year, an electoral one, including the European Parliament elections. So, where do we stand now, and what has to come next?
Well, I think we stand here partially relieved, if I can say, looking back to the end of 2023, when we were expecting what in fact was a jumbo election year. First half absolutely focused from our end on the European Parliament elections, whereby you take a snapshot of the European Union, see where you are, very different to 2019, undoubtedly will be very different in 2029. Fear that extremist anti-European forces would have been able to compose majorities. Big relief on the election night when we could analyze a situation, fragile, vulnerable, but a situation where the center can hold and majorities could be built. Then we had French parliamentary elections, still a lot of instability there. UK elections, which brought a change of administration, and finally a couple of other elections, but last but not least the United States elections, looking to what next year will bring elections in Germany and presidential elections in Poland. So 2024 ends, I think, with an understanding that democracy works. Voters went to vote, in some countries more than others. They showed skepticism. They gave us a message of a demand of responsibility. They asked for ways to be different, and they overwhelmingly asked from us as elected politicians to work towards a continent that needs to be stronger, one where we are entering the fourth winter of the war in Ukraine, and one where, justifiably so, as they would say, has been incoherent on many issues, and that's a demand that we cannot look away from now.
We'll come to the US elections and also to Ukraine later, but now I want to stay on the EU and the priorities that we see for the European Union. And when we talk about priorities, no doubt that we also talk about European competitiveness. So what do you think needs to happen in the coming years to make the EU more competitive globally?
First of all, coherence. If there's one thing that I think we all need to recognize is that, as Enrico Letta said in his report, we don't have one single market, we have 27 different ones. 2, integration. We celebrate the fact that we are a union. We celebrate the fact that we have removed physical borders for movement, but we're still very, very far away from making sure that our companies can be set up easily from one country to another, can move easily from one country to another, that capital can move freely from one country to another, that we are doing enough to harness the talent that we have on our continent and keeping it here, that we have not, and one example would be the automotive sector, for example, we have not protected our own. We have allowed if I may say, countries with only and sole economic interests that are not always to our benefit to take hold. And essentially, our young people are asking us, are you doing enough to protect us? Are you doing enough to educate us? Are we doing enough for now when we have a new United States administration to stand on our own 2 feet? Where are we on critical raw materials? How are we with our relations with Latin America? Why do we always need to wait for a Spanish presidency to have relations with Latin America and discuss with our Latin American counterparts? Why do we not talk to our African counterparts about trade, about investment? I think all of this would need to be piled into what we need. You mentioned the word priority, but I actually talk about survival and how we can exist with purpose. We hear too much about the European Union being in decline. I don't want to hear that word anymore. But realistically, when we look over the last decade, where the US economy has grown by 1.1% and the European Union one has grown by 0.8, we have a problem. When realistically we see how many patents, so we are the #1 continent for creation of patents. But in terms of putting them into motion, creating companies on what our researchers find, our licenses we hold, we lose. So this is something that, and I'm happy to see also the program of the brand new commission that we voted on last week in Strasbourg, is one that will need to focus on that. Because for the past 5 years we have been, and that was a different time of course, first we had a health pandemic, and then we had, we would say, a legislation managed by crisis, including an ongoing war on our continent. But now we need to shift focus on how we live with making sure our continent bounces back, I would say. And the proposals are on the table. The raw material is there. The talent is there. The resources are there. How do we integrate? How do we make sure, and we can talk about, of course, the Savings and Investment Union, Capital Markets Union, we've been talking about a digital euro, currencies, we've been talking about this for a long time. We've been talking about, and this is something that we're asked, we've been talking about granting, for example, candidate countries, the Western Balkans, access to our Rome for free possibility, access to our programs. We talk a lot about enlargement. Will that be one of the things that we will focus on in the next 5 years? I certainly hope so. The European Parliament certainly hopes for. So I think a lot of lessons learned from the elections and also what people want from us, but also from the economic situation and how we can really regain our competitive edge, because we have the tools. It's how we use them and how we reach our ends that matter.
So we mentioned that elections took place across the Atlantic in the United States, and there will be soon a second Trump administration taking over. How do we, as the European Union, emerge as a strong counterpart in this transatlantic alliance within the new context?
I think we need to move away from the tradition, if I say, of what we had of America elects and Europe reacts. I think we did that in 2016. We are in 2024. We are in a very different situation now in 2024. We are, from a security perspective, one, much more vulnerable, but secondly, we've invested much more. If you think to the kind of discussions there were with our US counterparts in 2016 during the first Trump administration. But also, let's not kid ourselves. The last 4 years of the Biden administration have not been very easy for us either. And most of the time you would find a European Union that relies on 27 plus 3, I like to say, different voices. How are we going to make sure we find alignment on where we agree? At the end of the day, the United States is our #1 partner. I've worked quite hard with our counterparts from Congress, where we were sometimes voting on the same legislative packages, financial packages for Ukraine, for example. We were, and we will continue to be together in making sure we have that proper transatlantic legislative dialogue. But since then, if you see, we have a 36% increase in how much we've spent on defense from 2021 to 2023. But we still spend collectively 1.9% of our GDP on defense. Russia spends 9%. So where are we going to be across that table when we meet the new United States administration and we discuss alignment on Iran, for example? How will we discuss China with the United States? Are we going to spend decades negotiating trade deals when other countries can do that in months? So I think that we really need to, rather than wait for what the United States is going to do, and then, as I said in the beginning, we react, but rather we say, how are we going to react? Donald Tusk put it very succinctly about a couple of days before the United States elections when he said the time for geopolitical outsourcing is over. It was completely correct. We are the continent with a war. We are entering the fourth winter. We commemorated, as difficult as it was, 1,000 days of war with President Zelensky 2 weeks ago in the plenary. We spend, yes, more on defense, still a lot left. But at the end of the day, what we need to avoid, and this is what scares me the most, is a protectionist race to the bottom. Because then nobody wins. And consumers lose on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that has to be the thread that unites us when discussing what is important over the next 4 years.
I'd like to focus a bit on the defense aspect. Given Trump's comments on defense and this difficult relationship with NATO, does the EU need to step up when it comes to its own defense and security?
Yes. But I also think that when the comments that were made in terms of the European Union not doing enough, that was at a time when the gap between the European Union investment or NATO investment compared to the United States was huge. That was a time when, one will remember, we questioned NATO and its purpose and how the reasons for its creation were still valid today. Since then, Sweden and Finland have joined. The investment has increased. We've seen unanimity between member states. I would have told you impossible at the beginning of the war that this would be possible for sanctions on Russia. We see an availability for current, outgoing, incoming European leaders of states and governments reiterating, not changing their position on assisting Ukraine, trying to find ways to help, as what it will clearly be Russia's tactic is to target Ukraine's energy and electricity infrastructure as we enter the cooler months. So I would make a distinction between what is said in a campaign and what is said as an administration. And without speculating, I am cautious, but also realistic that we can do better today than we did in 2016.
Indeed. So let's move again back to Europe and the enormous challenges that we face, especially in our European neighborhood. The situation in Ukraine remains very critical, and your unwavering commitment to support Ukraine has been a constant since the very beginning of the war. How can Ukraine, let's say, be stabilized after the war ends, and what role should the EU play in this effort?
Well, first of all, the unwavering commitment is not only a parliament one, but it's a union one. We see it also with extremely dedicated individuals on the European level, very happy, and this was a long-standing request by the European Parliament, and we welcome the fact that there is now a Commissioner for Defence. We also welcome the statements that have been made by the new President of the European Council and the new High Representative. And I say all this because it's important. That's not a given. This is something that we worked for. The majorities that we have, in order for us to be extremely fast when it comes to adopting macro-financial assistance for Ukraine, legislative instruments for ammunition supply, that go through the Parliament as a legislative proposal are adopted and voted within 8 weeks is not something normal. It is done because the commitment is there and the majorities are there. And that is what has kept us united, but has also kept the Ukrainians united. And when we meet our Ukrainian counterparts, we owe it to them. Because Putin didn't stop in 2008, he didn't stop in 2014, and he doesn't show any signs of stopping now. So we need to make sure, first of all, that the Ukrainians get through this winter. We need to make sure that if the Ukrainians ask us for help, we don't only promise it to them, but we deliver it. We were sometimes, actually quite a lot, too slow in delivering what we eventually delivered to Ukraine in any case. Now, does this mean that we need to have a proper and solid discussion internally? How are we in terms of preparedness? How are we in terms of human resources, in terms of our commitment on accession? How are we in terms of making use of extremely difficult but politically courageous and legally sound decisions on utilizing interest from frozen assets of Russia in order to help Ukraine? These are things that would have been unthinkable before the start of the war, but it was done. And I think that is the philosophy that we have to go into as we help Ukraine continue to defend its country, to defend its people against an illegal and unprovoked and unjustified aggression, and also move step by step closer and closer to us. And that means, yes, reconstruction, that means, yes, demining, that means, yes, bringing children that were abducted by Russia from Ukraine back home. That means returning safely refugees in the European Union, where solidarity of the European Union was shown so openly, and that's where you could see the true value of Europe in opening its hearts, its homes for Ukrainians. But we need to give our Ukrainian friends a perspective of what will happen. And at the end of the day, and we're asked this question a lot, I will fly to Warsaw tomorrow with the group leaders of the political group leaders of the European Parliament as we start to prepare for the Polish presidency. And in preparation for this visit, I have been asked, what do you think will be the outcome? And my answer has been very clear: nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. The easiest for us would be to be here and speculate about what could happen. But peace as an ultimate goal, with dignity, with justice, with freedom and territorial integrity, has to be everything we work for, because that is ultimately what our countries are built for, and that is ultimately what we, if I can talk about my personal experience when 20 years ago looked to the European Union in order to join it, because this was also the 20th year of the big enlargement, as we call it, and a very good enlargement and overwhelmingly successful enlargement, is one that where we were promised that freedom, that justice, that dignity, that territorial integrity. And that is the very basis of everything we need to work for with Ukraine.
Before we talk about EU enlargement, just a couple of words also on Russian interference in Europe, which is becoming a growing issue. How do we counter that?
By not ignoring it. For way too long we did, and we were warned. We were warned by countries that have long suffered such interference. We were effectively prepared for the European election, where we were, for sure considered a target. Why? Because the European Union is the antithesis of what anybody who wants to interfere with it wants it to be. And we're very proud of the values and our protection and how we really are united in that. We will now wait for the proposal on the so-called democracy shield. We need to also keep technology platforms and social media companies that are governed by our regime. When we look at the implementation of the Digital Services Act, that those companies, our partners, abide by our rules in Europe. I am, of course, concerned that we are always one step behind. And this is not only for interference, but it is also with an expectation of how we can regulate, if we can regulate the whole vast artificial intelligence field. But also I can tell you that as a mother, I am worried about what my children see online and what my children learn online. And you could see it during the campaign, and this is what we continue to be concerned about, you know, voter manipulation, candidate impersonation. These are things that will become much more widespread. They can because of technology, and it's in the interest of certain autocracies to use them. So we need to have a very strong resolve, we need to have a very strong legislative framework, but we need to have, most importantly, an enforcement framework. And that enforcement framework will require all European Union authorities, especially in those countries, especially for those campaigns where we can see that they are going to be direct targets.
And in your view, how do we achieve a successful integration? When we speak about the enlargement process, what are the prospects of this enlargement process? And how do we stabilize the region which is neighboring the European Union and ensure that the integration will be successful and that people will be satisfied with that in the EU and also in the countries that are applying to join the European Union?
By matching our words and actions with our rhetoric. If you think that there are countries that we have told for 20 years that they would join, and then campaign by campaign, council by council, summit by summit, they are told, actually no, you need to wait a little bit longer. Or we don't even tell them we need to wait a little bit longer. We just say, thank you very much, see you next summit. I remember being on that side of the table and being told that. It is incredibly difficult to be able to, as a democratic leader in those countries, to go back to your people and say, do you know what? They've asked us to wait a little bit longer, even when we've done everything we've been asked to do. So of course it's merit-based. It is a step-by-step. Things do not happen overnight. But when a step is made by our partners, we need to match it. Otherwise, we shouldn't start. Because campaigns are won and lost on the hope of EU membership. And the way to EU membership does not only have to be full of obstacles. It can be also full of incentives, access to programs, tangible programs where you can see it, where you can feel the European Union is going to increase the quality of your life. Pre-2024, everybody used to be afraid. 10 countries are going to join at the same time. This is going to change forever what the European Union is going to look like. Of course it did, but nobody would say for the worse. I remember the discussion before Romania and Bulgaria joined in 2007. I remember the discussion before Croatia joined in 2012. I mean, these are, and after every decision that is made, we always think that enlargement is a win-win. It's a win for the country that would have joined, and it's a win for the European Union. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Is it harder when you have a lot of reforms to do? Of course. But aren't those reforms aimed at improving a country? Judicially, protection of journalists, protection of minorities, making sure that, that your systems work, making sure that funds are going to be well distributed, making sure that there's transparency. All of these are what EU membership brings. And as I said, and there are some low-hanging fruit as well, that we could be ready and politically willing to do in order to give the populations of those countries a chance. Because the next thing we will know is that countries that would not like those countries to join the European Union to take over. And then we will have a bigger problem. And I think it is time that we have this discussion and that we do it openly, in transparency. Look, you have arrived, we can go to the next step. Look, you have not. Look, you have regressed. Look, we have to pause. All of this is a discussion to have. But the worst thing would be that we have all sorts of great summits where everybody takes a photo and goes home and does nothing. That's my biggest fear, as a message that we would be sending to the population in those countries. Frankly, we've done it for far too long. How much longer are they going to accept that we do it? Last thing, let's also celebrate the fact that finally we are close on Bulgaria and Romania joining the Schengen area. I mean, how long did that take? But we are there. And I think it's also in our interest to celebrate that finally our Romanian and Bulgarian colleagues, brothers and sisters can have access to the exact same rights that we have. But for far too long we said no. How could we justify that? That was difficult, but now we managed. And I think that that's something that we can look at also as 2024, having brought that much needed step to be made.
Yeah, and by the way, it's really impressive, the level of democratic resilience that we see in those countries immediately in the European neighborhood, and the engagement of the civil society. And I would like to hear your opinion also about our European civil society and the role that it plays. How can the EU further promote civic engagement in the European Union and increase the political participation, particularly of young people? Because sometimes we see more engagement and more democratic resilience elsewhere, but sometimes in the EU we struggle, and you are strongly advocating for that. So what is your experience? What is your take? Is there something we can do more and or better?
Both, more and better. This election, we saw a huge increase of interest by young people. Our challenge was, how are we going to engage them enough for them not to retreat to the fringes and the extremes? That's one. How do we do that? By political parties not taking their voters for granted. By elected politicians looking beyond their immediate re-election, but behaving responsibly. Now, this is particularly difficult for a sitting politician to say it, but it's important to say it and to do it. Two, that you have candidates that span the demographics of your country. We still have way too few women members of parliament. It's still too difficult to be a woman in politics today. It's still too difficult to be the representative of a minority and get elected today in Europe in 2024. We talk a lot about it, but we don't do enough. And that requires all of us to place the same effort that I like to say those who came before us placed in us. Someone picked us up and said, you should be a candidate. This happened to me 20 years ago. And it was something that I thought impossible, especially if you come from a part of a society, a family that is not used to politics. But if we don't do that, we are not going to regenerate. And the risk is then that eventually young people will stop voting. And when young people stop voting, then we do no longer represent the societies that we are elected to represent. And to do that, we need to be more engaging, we need to listen, we need to make sure that they are involved at every step of the decisions. We need not only to celebrate, I like to say, women's rights and equality on the 8th of March every year, only to forget and remember again the 8th of March of the next year. I mean, same with every time we have a youth event of the Parliament, every time. Today, for example, is the day for a European Day of Disabilities. It's the same. We only talk about how still we have a lot to do in order to level up our societies on the 3rd of December. How can this be? So my commitment, my Parliament's commitment, and on this I can tell you that there is a huge amount of work that will need to be done, but the effort and the ambition and the will is there across the political spectrum. Because as people before us brought us up, we need to help bring people up with us. And if we engage, if we excite, if we manage to enthuse our younger generations, then they will vote, they will run, and they will lead. I'm convinced about this. But we just need to do more. And we don't need, we cannot avoid debates. We have to understand society changes, and we don't change, we die. Same for societies, same for political organizations, same for political parties. And that is something that I would like, and I give credit also, of course, to the Martin Center for being innovative, for being creative, but also for reaching out, going beyond the sort of classic barriers that we were used to, if you will. But I'm confident we can do it, and I think that we can always think of what we could have done better in the past, but we have 5 years ahead of us, and now let's make sure we don't waste them.
To conclude, and looking ahead to 2025, what is the #1 goal you will have in mind every morning before starting your work as European Parliament President?
First, I need to make sure my children go to school. And secondly, that's a classic mom reply. Secondly, you mentioned resilience in a lot of your questions. I think resilience is the key goal in everything we do. We as a parliament will need to be resilient in keeping strong to our principles. We need to make sure that we do a lot to stay relevant in what we do, what we legislate on. And we also need a high dose of realism of where we are today. The world is difficult in 2024. I don't think it will be much easier in 2025. You need leadership, you need responsibility, and you need to make sure, and you said every morning, is that when I go to sleep at night, I know that I've done my best. Tomorrow is another day. I have to wake up and do my best again.
And on that...
At least I try.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President.